supply of drug was totally out of control. That was the backdrop of the convention. So this convention was signed to curb the shipments of narcotic drugs that were not meant to be used for medical purposes. It called on all signatories to strictly regulate the distribution and production of opium, morphine and cocaine, and to prohibit the non-medical use of the drugs. And Russia, by the way, was one of the signatories. So over the next 50 years, a multilateral system to control production, trafficking, and abuse of drugs was developed. The scope of the controlled drugs has expanded over the years, and the means of international cooperation have developed also. So the 3 international drug control conventions, which were adopted under the auspices of the United Nations in 1961, 1971, and 1988, they enjoy almost universal adherence. They share the same fundamental goal: to limit the use of narcotic drugs to medical and scientific purposes. Narcotic substances must not be taken for pleasure, as they are addictive and can have harmful and in some cases even fatal side effects. Today, this premise is being increasingly called into question in the international drug policy debate by those who argue that the conventions have failed, that they are obsolete and must be revised or even abolished. The initiative in this debate, I'm sorry to say, has passed to those who are pressing for a paradigm shift involving decriminalization and in some cases also legalization of drugs, primarily cannabis. The opponents of the conventions, they describe it as a debate between what they call between prohibitionism and pragmatism, between ideology and evidence, between status quo and reform, or between human rights defenders and repressive law enforcement. So those who argue for revision of the conventions or even for abolishing them describe themselves in very positive terms. They are pragmatic, evidence-based, reform-inclined, and defend human rights, while those who defend the conventions are described as driven by ideology, repressive, and defending status quo no matter what. There are nuances, of course, but looking at the extreme positions, I think this is a fair description. I will later on try to describe the more nuanced debate positions as well. So let us now take a closer look at some of the arguments and the underlying notions of the opponents of the conventions. They say, for example, that people have always used drugs and always will. Most drug use is non-problematic. They say that marijuana generally is more harmful than alcohol and tobacco if used, is not more harmful than alcohol and tobacco if it is used in moderation. They say that what they call prohibition creates new public health problems, that many of the harms associated with the use of drugs are not caused by the drugs, but by the fact that it is illegal to use them. And finally, they say that legalizing drugs takes the market away from criminals. Before examining some of these arguments, I would like to say something about the use of the term prohibition to describe drug policies that are grounded in the UN Drug Control Conventions. The public understanding of the word prohibition derives from the national ban on the sale, production and transportation of alcohol in the United States from 1920 to 1932, which was popularized by gangster movies about characters such as Al Capone. The idea here is to influence the direction of our thoughts so that when we hear the word prohibition, we immediately think of criminal syndicates and rampant corruption among politicians and within police forces. So, if conventions-based drug policy is about prohibition, then it must lead to corruption and organized crime. This is how the thinking is meant to function. I have problems with this analogy. First of all, alcohol is a substance that is part of our cultural heritage. Its use is extremely widely spread, and it would not be possible to forbid it, even though it may cause major health problems such as liver problems and increased risks of various cancers. Not to forget the social consequences such as domestic violence. But why should we allow the free availability of marijuana and other narcotic drugs because we allow alcohol that is also harmful? They don't answer that question. Secondly, and what may be even more important, is the fact that the drug conventions do not prohibit the use of drugs. They regulate the use, the production, the trade, etc., based on the scientific knowledge of their dependence-producing characteristics and their side effects. And you remember that they call themselves scientific, while those who base themselves on the conventions are not scientific. But the drugs are placed in different categories with varying degrees of control, and all is based on the fact that most of the drugs are essential for treating pain, etc., and that they at the same time have very dangerous side effects. And this regulation is, as I said, evidence-based. And the conventions have agreed procedures for making changes in the level of control, for including new substances, and for removing substances that no longer fulfill the requirements for international control based on new evidence. Let's look at cocaine, for example. It was originally used for treatment of morphine dependence. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, he tried to treat his morphine-dependent colleague and friend, Dr. von Markov, by using cocaine as a cure, and it did not work. Dr. von Markov developed cocaine dependence in addition to the morphine dependence that he was already suffering from. The proponents of drug policy reform, this is their own words, this is what they call themselves. They argue for allowing the use of narcotic drugs for any purpose, including for pleasure. They do recognize that it would be necessary to have some kind of regulation of the market. For example, specialist pharmacists would be trained and licensed to vend drugs for recreational users with certain restrictions, such as age limitations, for example. I just would like to take this example from something called Transform Drug Policy Foundation. It's a UK-based foundation active in the debate for the abolishment of the drug control conventions. And in its brochure, it extends its thanks to past funders such as the European Commission. Now, let us return to the underlying notions and the arguments for abolishing the present drug control regime. The argument that people have always used drugs and always will, and that most drug use is non-problematic, leads them to the conclusion that investing in prevention is not worthwhile. They argue that prevention does not work, and that it is definitely not worth putting any effort into information campaigns. Okay, there is some truth to the limitation of standalone information. It's not sufficient to bring about behavioral change, but information combined with community-based, family-based, school-based, etc. interventions can make a huge difference. If we did not believe so, why would we spend any money at all on health promotion, on advising children and their families on healthy eating, on the benefits of exercise, etc., or for that matter, educating the public about HIV/AIDS? It would be of no use if we didn't believe it would. This is one demarcation line. Investment in prevention by those who argue for the conventions versus skepticism among those who see drug use as inevitable. Another demarcation line, the argument by the defenders of the conventions-based policies is that drugs themselves cause harm and therefore they must be controlled, including law enforcement measures to limit availability. This stands against the opponents of the conventions who argue that the control measures cause more harm than the drugs do. One example they give is that addicts are forced to commit crimes to pay for a habit that would be easily affordable if it were legal. Another example they give is street gang violence, Because drugs are illegal, participants in the drug trade cannot go to court to settle disputes. So when black market contracts are breached, the result is often some form of violent sanction, which usually leads to retaliation and then to open warfare in the streets. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention looked at 556 gang-related homicides and over 2,000 non-gang killings in 17 US states. They found, for example, that in Los Angeles, less than 5% of the killings were related to known drug trafficking or use. There were states with higher percentage, but the conclusion was that there is little connection between gang homicides and drug trade, drug use and crime. So if we legalize drugs, will we take the market away from the criminals? Let us look at the role that legal substances play in organized crime. Alcohol smuggling, for example, has become big business for organized crime in the UK, with tax losses in unpaid duties as high as £1.2 billion. I think it's about 1.9, close to $2 billion per year. Unpaid duty on wine and beer not included. The UK supply chain for alcohol is supposed to be tightly regulated, but the BBC found armed gangs and even paramilitaries have muscled into the duty-free market, which according to UK tax and custom authorities is now run by organized crime. And gang members made a fortune buying luxury properties across Europe and high-performance cars. The illicit trafficking in tobacco is a multi-billion-dollar business, fueling organized crime and corruption, robbing governments of needed tax money and spurring addiction to a deadly product. So profitable is the trade that tobacco is the world's most widely smuggled legal substance. And this booming business stretches from counterfeiters in China to warlords in Pakistan and North Africa. According to CNN, more than 60% of all cigarettes sold in New York were smuggled in from another state in the US. Big differences in taxes make it an attractive business for criminals. The perpetrators range from small family business all the way up to international terrorists, and these are legal substances. I think I've given you enough examples of arguments. Now let us look at who they are, the groups who argue against the drug policy based on the UN conventions. Some are libertarians who believe in the primacy of individual liberty. Some are liberal think tanks. Lately, however, representatives of governments and international organizations have joined the debate, and the latter are generally more nuanced. They share the opinion that the dominant drug policy has failed to reduce drug abuse and illegal trade. They argue that the present focus on what they call repressive law enforcement must be replaced by policies that are more evidence-based and more respectful of human rights. They tend to put more focus on assisting problematic drug users than on preventing the use of drugs in the first place. Thus, they emphasize social services, needed exchange, substitution treatment and other measures to facilitate a decent life for drug addicts. Generally, they combine the focus on drug addicts with the view that supply reduction measures are insufficient or futile. In 2010, a number of prominent Latin American politicians and famous cultural figures established the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy, under the leadership of 3 former presidents, Cardoso from Brazil, Gaviria from Colombia, and Zedillo from Mexico. They turned against what they called prohibitionist policies. According to them, these policies have not yielded the expected results. They proposed a new paradigm based on 3 directives: treating drug users as a matter of public health, reducing drug consumption through information, education, and prevention, focusing repression on organized crime. So they are more nuanced than the ones I talked about in the beginning. They propose to change the status of addicts from drug buyers in the legal market to that of patients cared for in the public health system. In addition, they want to evaluate from a public health standpoint what they say, and I quote, the convenience of decriminalizing the possession of cannabis for personal use. Last year, the tone of the debate was changed that when the Global Commission on Drug Policy was formed by former President Cardoso, former Greek Prime Minister Papandreou, former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Louise Arbour, and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, among others. The Global Commission approached Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, presenting a report that is critical of the International Drug Control Conventions and called for what they say fundamental reforms of the global prohibition regime. The report describes what the Commission sees as the failure of drug law enforcement policies in reducing global drug supply. The Commissioners are of the opinion that war on drugs has contributed to the growth of organized crime and violence. Furthermore, they stress that repressive drug law enforcement practices force drug users away from public health services and into hidden environments where HIV risks become markedly elevated. The Global Commission positions itself close to the arguments put forward by the most liberal think tanks as described earlier. For example, they argue that the success of drug policy should be measured by a reduced rate of transmission of HIV and other infectious diseases, fewer overdose deaths, reduced drug market violence, fewer individuals incarcerated, and lowered rates of problematic substance use. But they do not argue that it should be measured by low prevalence of drug use. Kofi Annan has left the Global Commission, but it is still the most distinguished group of high-level leaders to ever call for far-reaching drug policy changes, including decriminalization.